It's really important to note that development and administration of the floodplain management ordinance is a local government responsibility. A lot of times, and I experienced this myself, having been at FEMA and also working in local government, is that there's some confusion that FEMA is supposed to enforce the local floodplain laws, and we don't do that. We provide regulatory oversight for local governments, but the local government is responsible, in this case the city of Philadelphia, is responsible for the administration of the local floodplain ordinance. Okay, going on to the next slide. So preliminary maps are forthcoming. So there's different floodplain, how we develop the maps there's a very long process, and I have a slide that's going to talk about how the process works. We're in the process of updating maps throughout Region 3. You can visit our map service center to get copies of the preliminary maps, and they're projected to be released January 10th, which is coming up. Today is the 9th, tomorrow is the 10th. I guess it's, oh yeah, because this was done about a week ago. So the preliminary maps are forthcoming, and they're going to be released on January 10th. You can go to the Map Service Center website to get more information. There are some handouts over here that have the website information in the pamphlet. You'll be able to get that to that pamphlet. Next slide. Okay, so Philadelphia joined the NFIP on January 14th, 1972, and the last effective flood insurance study and flood insurance map is from 2007. So now we're in the process of updating the maps, which we're doing all over the country, including in several places in Region 3. And part of this analysis includes reanalyzing tidal portions of the Delaware River and tidal influence tributaries only. The tidal update will be performed as a part of the physical map revision, which I just talked about, which will be released tomorrow. Next slide. So why we do this? The map. Yes.
Can you let them know the maps aren't effective until 2015?
Yeah, I'm getting to that.
Okay, thank you.
They're
all getting scared looking at me.
I have a slide that goes through the whole process. So the preliminary map is the very first step in the process, and that map is going to be released tomorrow. So the old maps, which are from 2007, I know that sounds like it wasn't too long ago, but the data that the maps are based on is from a very, very long time ago. And just, I know some people won't be able to see it, but the last study that was done was, this is based on data from the 70s. So I can tell you in New York, in New York City, their flood maps are based on data from the 80s. So obviously the data is very old. Philadelphia's data is very old. It's time to update the data based on new technology, this technology called LIDAR, which provides much better detailed analysis of the floodplain. So that's the data that's the basis for the newer maps.
Next one. You said Philadelphia's data is based from the 70s?
The current map, which was effective in 2007, that data that the map was based on is very old. As you can see from the slide, it's from the 1970s. So we have to get up. A lot has changed since the 70s in terms of mapping and technology. So we're moving with the times and getting better data, a more accurate depiction of the floodplain, a more refined view of the areas with the maps. Okay, next slide. Okay. So now, there's a couple that I know this is, I've been with FEMA about 3 years, and before that I used to actually work for the city of Philadelphia. This is really complicated stuff, and I don't say that to talk down to you, I say that because you all seem like very smart people, and it's just, we're going to walk through it step by step. I just want to make sure you understand this is really complicated, and it takes time, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. So there's a couple key things that you need to know about the maps. The first thing is called the base flood elevation, or it's commonly referred to as the BFE. And that's the height in feet above a certain datum, and a datum is the data point on the map. And the datum that's used for these maps is called the National Geodetic Vertical Datum of 1929. So I know it's very complicated. It's a lot of technical terms. Basically, the base flood elevation is the point at which you have to be above the base flood elevation. And that's depicted on the maps. And from this point, it shows you that at any point you could have a 1% chance of a flood in any given year. So I know people talk about the every year, the 100-year floodplain, the 500-year floodplain. That's actually the annualization of this percentage chance. So in any given year, at the base flood elevation, there's a 1% chance that there could be a flood at that elevation. I know that's a lot, that can be very confusing because people talk about the 100-year flood, and you say, well, I haven't had a flood in 100 years, how is that possible? Or you had the same flood 2 years in a row that's happened, you know, in some parts of the region with Irene and then Lee, they had the same flooding in less than a year apart. It's really just a percentage chance, so that's important to keep in mind. The next thing you need to know, another key term with these maps, are Zone AE. These are the most at-risk zones on a particular map. And these are defined by the wave heights ranging from 0 to 3 feet. Now I have another slide that has a little picture that will help us walk through that. And then there's something called the limit of moderate wave action. And this is defined by the area subject to wave action with waves greater than 1.5 feet in height. So this is all about depicting risk and explaining which areas are more at risk than other areas. So these are some key terms. If you're going to, after this meeting, go back and look at the maps, that you need to keep in mind as you're looking at the maps because they help indicate where there's more risk versus less risk in a particular area.
So what zone are we in?
You're AE,
And
so
that's the highest?
that's, well, yes, that is one of the highest zones.
So how did we get there?
That's a good question. I actually, Mr. Simone is on top of it.
We didn't have to have flood insurance, all of a sudden we
Yeah.
did it the highest.
And like I said, a lot of that has to do with the technology that has now, you know, technology has changed since the last set of maps were issued. And so with this new technology, we can do more refined analysis. And so I can tell you, not to
The
get,
highest, I mean, we're at the highest.
you're at one of the highest, yes.
Because we didn't even have to have flood insurance at one time. It was changed.
I understand that. And like I said, I'm going to go more in a little bit more detail. Now, I will tell you that like, I spent some time in New York and New Jersey for Hurricane Sandy, and a lot of communities in that area faced this as well. They, on previous maps, did not have any indication of risk, and then they had significant flooding in Hurricane Sandy, and then when the maps were reanalyzed after Sandy, it turned out that they had significant risk as well. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there has been additional development in communities, the technology for doing the mapping has changed substantially, and so while you may not have perceived you were at risk before, in fact, all of this time you could have been at risk and not even known it. And I know that that's difficult to understand, and paying flood insurance can be very costly for people, especially in this economy. I understand and I empathize with you, but you're not the only community that's facing this right now. And this is something that is happening all over. And Hurricane Sandy really shows us that we have to evaluate our risk effectively and accurately so that you understand what your risk is. And in some cases, you know, I think you would be in a worse spot if we pretended like you weren't at risk and then, God forbid, something did happen in your community. I think that would actually put us in a more perilous condition than understanding now where your risk is today versus withholding this type of information. Okay, so next slide. Okay. So our coastal study and outreach, we actually have a whole website that, I mean, if you really want to spend a lot of time, you can't sleep at night, and you want to learn everything you can about our coastal outreach study, you can go to region3r3coastal.com, and there's a treasure trove of information on there about the coastal restudy and what's happening with that, including information on all of the outreach activities associated with the remapping. And so, okay, so some of the flood map resources, I mentioned the websites. What we'll do is at the end of the meeting, we'll go back to this slide and keep all the website information up. So if you want to take a picture of it with your phone or write them down, you'll be able to do that. You can also call the FEMA Mapping Center. There's an 800 number. And then there's like I said, I mentioned a couple of other risk portals as well. So, next slide. Okay, so now this goes to your question about what the next steps are. So tomorrow we issue these maps, and like you're saying, well, then what does it mean? There's a good amount of time between when we issue the map and when the map is finalized, and there's opportunities for you and the community, it's the city of Philadelphia, to provide input into the maps if you believe that the map is incorrect. So the first thing I said is we issue the map, then there's a community review period, then there's some community meetings that happen. This is not the formal community meeting. So this is just, you were asked to come here and present, so this is not the formal community meeting that's a part of the regulatory process. So there will be even more meetings in Philadelphia about these maps going forward.
Is the city involved in this?
Yes. Yeah. So, and then during the community meeting and review period, you have an opportunity to file appeals with the city if you believe the maps are inaccurate. So that's something that will have to be considered. And then the final firm is effective. It's typically a year after this, from the date that we issue the preliminary map. So there's a very long very involved, very bureaucratic process, as you can imagine, to go from a preliminary map to a final map. And there are steps in that process that allow the community, people, everybody in this room, to be informed about what has changed, why those changes were made, and it gives you an opportunity to provide comment on those changes if you believe the maps are incorrect. Next slide.
What criteria are you using to prove that it's incorrect?
I'm sorry.
What criteria are you using to prove that it's incorrect?
Okay, so just so everybody, in case people appear to hear, folks, she asked what criteria are used to prove the map is incorrect. Well, if you go to the, I had that page with all the websites. If you go to that website, it talks about the appeals process and the grounds by which you can appeal. You can appeal for primarily technical reasons. So if you believe that the maps were calculated incorrectly, if any of the elevations were calculated incorrectly, if there were things that were not included on the map that may affect the flooding environment in your neighborhood, those are the grounds for appeal. They are technical in nature. It is not typically, I just don't think I flood a lot. So you have to have a technical basis for your appeal. Okay.
Can I ask you a question? I bought my house in 1980, right?
Yes.
And I never had to pay flood insurance. Okay? So about 2007, that's when they decided to start charging me flood insurance, but I never had a flood. So they were saying when it was built around the 1970s, But then I went to the city. They said I should have a grandfather, but they wouldn't accept my grandfather.
Okay, so I think that's the kind of question where a one-on-one discussion with Rich would be very helpful for you.
Exactly. So we're going to reserve all questions until after the presentation.
Okay.
Rick Sabota is going to be able to ask you questions. Okay?
Okay, so this is my final slide, so let me just finish up, and then we're going to turn it over to Rich, and he's going to go through his slides. And then I really think where you're going to get the most value out of this is the individual time with Rich. So some of the community, I want to go through what the responsibilities are for the communities in reviewing the maps. So first, in reviewing the firm, just so we're all clear, the firm is the flood insurance rate map, and that's where you review the preliminary firms and make corrections, comments, and appeals where appropriate through the process that I showed you on the slide before. They conduct outreach, and that's outreach to make sure people understand the changes, understand if there are changes, understand where they fit in relative to those changes, and understand the process from going to preliminary to going to final.
Marianne,
Yes.
community responsibilities in this case refer to the local agency, correct?
Yes.
Not the city, not this group.
Not this group, no, not this community group. This is the city of Philadelphia's community responsibility. And then updating their ordinance. So as a part of the final, making the maps effective, the community, in this case the city of Philadelphia, is responsible for updating and adopting their floodplain ordinance. It's the city of Philadelphia.
And a specific committee or name of the committee or, where would you go? Just call the city of Philadelphia, I doubt it.
Maybe that woman there. Yes, we could, my name is yourself. I'm Paula Brumlow with the Planning Commission. We formally have a floodplain manager. My name is Paula Brumlow. I am with the Planning Commission. I was sitting in the I'm going to stand in the office because I work with the Planning Commission. Part of our job at the Planning Commission is to basically be the clearinghouse for the FEMA information. So when we have all of these, if you have a question about the map, if you want to do an engineering study, they're going to filter through me and I'll filter them to FEMA. So I can explain the process a little differently at a different meeting if you want to go over that. The meetings, the maps that are coming out are drafts, are not the final maps.
Yes, they're
And
preliminary.
they will be available in our office for anybody to come in and look. So they will be public and access. As soon as they give them to me, I will let everybody know.
You have the address or?
1515 Arch Street.
All right, now.
How about a phone number or something? You have a somewhere?
We're going to actually, we will do that at the end of the meeting, but we'll pass it out. If you sign in, they can email you all my information. That's why you need to sign in.
Okay, now, so will
I don't want to
you-
interrupt your part of the meeting.
I understand, but will you be willing to commit to coming to this community another time and addressing these issues?
I just told Steve I will come out anytime you need me to.
Okay, so you'll be.
I can't address your insurance
For this
costs
event.
or why FEMA made the maps. I can just address the process.
Okay,
Okay?
And so like I said, the process usually takes about 12 months, and we're on day one of a 365-day or so process. Now, if there are appeals, then that process can be elongated. But remember, if, you know, like I said, we're on a marathon, and we're at like the quarter-mile mark for this marathon. So nothing is going final tomorrow. Like I said, they're preliminary. So if you walk out of here with one thing, please understand that the maps that exist today will be in effect until the new maps are adopted by the city of Philadelphia, and that usually takes about 12 months. So, all right.
Question?
Excuse me,
Yes.
another question. If anybody wants a copy of this slide, will you send them?
Yes, we will send this slide deck to Joanne, and then anybody that signs up with their email address, she can shuttle it to whoever wants it.
The second thing, up in New York, the water line up in New York, everywhere places you get the water line is where it's flooded. And it's the project is supposed to be starting down here, and I think it's around now. And they have an exhibit at the Chemical Heritage Foundation, and I was wondering if her information is going to be incorporated into this.
I'm not familiar with that project, but why don't we talk offline, and I'll get some details. Okay, so now I'm going to sit down now, and Rich Sabota is going to give his portion of the presentation, and then we'll take general questions, and then you can have your individual questions. Once again, I want to emphasize, probably the best thing you're going to get from this meeting is getting some one-on-one time with Rich to deal with your issues.
Can I ask a question about FEMA?
Sure.
I read in the news that there was a proposal by Senator Robert Menendez to block the FEMA, this preliminary maps. Has that passed, or what's the progress of that?
So there's a new act called the Bigger Orders Act of 2012, which drastically changes how the flood insurance program is managed.
Okay, so that has to do with NFIP.
It does have to do with the NFIP.
Okay.
That law is in effect right now.
Okay.
There are some people in Congress that are not happy with the way that the law is affecting the rates of individual homeowners in their district, and they have put forward several pieces of legislation to counter the currently enacted law. Whatever Congress decides to do, FEMA will implement, but right now we're working with the law that's currently enacted, which is the Bigger Orders Act of 2012. But like I said, made a lot of changes to flood insurance, including increasing rates of some people, but also decreasing rates of some people. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the current law in effect that's most I guess relevant for your question is the Bigger Orders Act of 2012. There are several pieces of legislation making their way through the House and the Senate that may change that law, but that has not been done yet.
The question was, how does the landfill affect everything you're here to talk about tonight with regards to flooding and everything along those lines? For Clearview, I think most of you know it's right on Darby. It's right where Darby and Cobbs Creek come together. It's where the Eastwick Recreational Park is. It's where the recreation center is. I think everybody knows that general area. So as part of the cleanup, one of the things that the record of decision is going to touch on is we're going to be doing a lot of work on the landfill. And in preparation for that, as part of the design process, we need to evaluate anything that we're going to do with the cleanup, how it will affect the floodplain. Nothing that we can do with the cleanup can either increase or decrease the 100-year floodplain, whether it's the current version or whatever is going to be proposed. So there's federal regulations that say that everything that we do, in addition to all the different things with regards to the cleanup has to, I think it's in water, the cleanup has to take into account impacts to flooding, and we can't do any negative impacts on flooding in the area. I saw hands come up. I don't want to take too much time from this.
Yes, Josh, right?
Yes.
At a previous EPA meeting I attended, you put a time frame on when cleanup activities may take place. And it seemed to be, the projection seemed to be at best 10 to 15 years. Yes.
10 to 15 years from now? Before the cleanup started?
Yes, because it had to go through so many processes.
It better not take 10 to 15 years.
And that's what I was hoping.
No,
the question is, where are you at in that time?
All right, so the record of decision needs to be finalized. That's the legal document that says this is the cleanup. We want that done this year. this fiscal year.
The record of decision.
Record of decision called the ROD, all right?
Okay.
So the ROD we want done this year. Now, there's potential responsible parties that we are considering to see. EPA didn't put the landfill there, so we're trying to see for whom we have a case that we can get those individuals or those entities to sign up for the cleanup. That after the record of decision, that whole negotiation process with those entities starts. And that can take anywhere from 6 to 12 to 18 months. And depending on how that's going, either EPA can start with the design, and there's funds that are readily available to start the design part.
So EPA has some funds that they can start with that?
There's no funds right now for the design, earmarked for the Clearview design, because you can't get any funds until you have a ROD.
Right.
So once you get a ROD, then we can say, okay, either the responsible parties are going to do the design, or we don't know what's going to happen, so let's start the design with EPA funds. So the design can take, it's a large landfill, it's like, imagine building a building, only you're designing it for underground and you don't know everything that's down there. It's very complicated. So that can take time, that can take 12 to 18 months as well. Once that design is done, you're looking at, once the design is done, if responsible parties are paying for it, they will have been signed up with an enforcement agreement with EPA and the Department of Justice that establishes that they have the ability to pay for the remedy and establishes payment schedules. If there are no responsible parties who are paid, then basically once the design is done, we in our region in Philadelphia have to go to EPA headquarters and make our case, make our proposal. Every year, there's what's called the National Remedy Prioritization Panel, and they decide what new cleanups get funded every year. All the cleanups that are ongoing always get funded first, and then whatever's left over is used for the new cleanups. So there's like it's a lot of like, if this, then you go here, or if there's responsible parties, it goes down this path. So it's not an exact number, but 10 to 15 years is no way, there's no.
So,
That we would ever think it would take that long to get
and I know
started.
that you can't,
Right.
but certainly a ballpark, a reasonable ballpark would be what?
Well, if you add up,
18 months,
so
18
you gotta talk,
months?
let's say worst case scenario, end of this year.
6 years, 6 years before cleanup can start?
No, I wouldn't think it would be that long, no.
Well, if certain things take 18 months.
It depends, it really depends. I mean, you're talking end of September is when you get the record of decision. Then let's say we start immediately on the design, you're talking another 12 months there to 18, so you could stick that till the, maybe March of 2016. When we'll be ready to start the remedial action, then it's a matter of, where's the money?
I'm faced with a very difficult decision this evening, and I've only had about 20 minutes to make that decision. And the decision is, what do I want to talk about first? Do I want to talk about actuarial mysteries? Or do I want to talk about actuarial nightmares? And quite honestly, I'll probably talk about both of them as I'm going along my presentation, but let's go into the presentation. Again, I'll take about 10 minutes to talk to you, and after that, I'll start answering questions. Very good. All right. One of the brochures that we have available for you is the top 10 facts for consumers. From what I've been hearing so far, sounds to me like you're a pretty well-educated crowd when it comes to matters related to flood insurance and other matters. But some of the top 10 facts that we have to share with you, we've found out over the years that an awful lot of people aren't aware of some of these facts, so I just want to take a minute or two to go through. If it hasn't already been said, everybody lives in a flood zone. Everybody, including me, including you. The question is, how high of a risk do you face for flooding? And the answer, quite honestly, is we don't know. We're not sure. As we're here this evening, and it's the dead of winter, there's minor flooding going on further on up to Delaware. Now, who would expect flooding events to be happening during the dead of winter? And it just kind of shows you some of the unpredictable nature of flooding. There's lots of other things that are involved in the likelihood of flood happening and the severity of flood happening. But no matter where your property is located, you have some risk from flooding. And one of the things that you can do to protect yourself, of course, is to buy flood insurance. Most of you, probably every single one of you, know that flood damage is not covered under your homeowner's policy. There's an awful lot of people outside this room who don't know that, and they find out the hard way after the fact that the homeowner's policy that they thought they could depend upon is not going to do them any good for their flood damage. So you may have seen our ads on TV as well, but we try to make that very, very important point clear as we go along. You can buy flood insurance no matter what your risk is. Some of you are in those zones that we call AE, and yes, those are some of the highest zones for the level of risk involved. Some of you, your property is not inside the AE zones, but you may still face flood loss anyway, and we do offer flood insurance whether you're in a high risk, moderate risk, or low risk area, and I'll be happy to talk to you about that in a little more detail as we're going along. One of the things that we do offer is something called a preferred risk policy, and that preferred risk policy, there are some eligibility criteria that you need to meet, but if you meet those eligibility criteria, you can buy flood insurance coverage, and it's relatively affordable.
But Mr. Scott, if you could speak up just a little bit.
Certainly will. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, flood insurance, contents coverage, if you're not aware of it, most people, most policies cover only buildings, but you're always already aware of the fact that your personal property and contents is subject to flood damage as well, and yes, you can insure personal property and contents. We have limits of coverage that for a homeowner can go up to $250,000 on building and $100,000 on contents, and depending upon your level of risk, you can determine what the amount of coverage is that would best suit your purposes, and I'll be talking about amount of coverage later on as it affects the cost of flood insurance. There's a 30-day waiting period usually for a flood insurance policy to go into effect, so keep that in mind. If you don't currently have a flood insurance policy and you're thinking of buying one, sooner is better than later when it comes to flood insurance purchase, because 30 days is an awful long time to sandbag and pump and pray. Last but not least, federal disaster assistance is not the answer, and you're probably already aware of this too, but most flooding events that occur do not warrant federal presidential declarations and do not get disaster assistance. So one of the good things about buying a flood insurance policy, you can depend upon that policy no matter what, whether there is a widespread event that results in a presidential declaration, or if it's just a local event, that policy will protect you. The information on the screen right now is actually taken from this brochure, and it's some of the contact information that may be helpful to you. When someone asks me about flood insurance, I will typically tell them the first thing that they want to do, if they haven't already done so, is talk to their current insurance agent or company. And the reason I tell you that, your current insurance agent or company hopefully knows you much better than I do and can provide you with advice and information that's tailored to you as an individual and your individual risk situation. In addition to that, we do have a number of different websites. If you have internet access and if you've never been on the website, I suggest that you go on www.floodsmart.gov. www.floodsmart.gov, and you will get educated pretty quickly about some of the more important aspects of the National Flood Insurance Program. Last but not least, you've got contact records out there, so again, if I don't get to talk to you individually tonight, I will get to talk to you individually when I call you back on the phone. One of everybody's very important questions is what factors affect my rates, and there are a number of things that come into play. Bear with me while I get my copy of the slide in front of me so I don't have to move so much and lose my microphone. All right, again, one of the important things to remember is depending upon how much of anything you purchase, that's going to affect the cost. So the more flood insurance purchased, the more of the cost involved, but that's just one of the factors that you already knew. Deductibles, most people are familiar with the concept of a deductible, but basically it's how much you have to pay out of your own pocket before the policy coverages kick in. And needless to say, the higher deductible, the less expensive the insurance coverage is to buy, but it's always a risk because, again, you need to remember that that deductible amount is what needs to come out of your pocket before the coverage kicks in. So be very careful and know your own risk tolerance, as they call it, and know what can come out of your own pocket. The amount of deductible on this flood insurance product, on your homeowners, or any other product, auto, that carries a deductible, that's something that warrants a good conversation between you and your insurance agent so you can really explore what is going to work best for you individually in your own financial situation. The age of the building, the flood zone, of course, is a pretty important determinant in terms of how much the cost is. Needless to say, if your property is located in a high-risk zone, it's probably going to be relatively more expensive to insure than a property that is not located in a high-risk zone. But that's, again, a relatively general rule. There can be changes to that, and your own individual circumstances. It's probably something that we need to talk about and take a look at. The age of the building is a very important factor, and I'm sorry to say that older buildings, the ones we know and love and have grown up in, most of those buildings were not designed with flood in mind. And so when a flood does come, those are the types of buildings that are also most likely to suffer significant flood damage. Newer construction, or what we call post-firm construction, you can see the type of structure that we're talking about anytime up on pilings, piers, posts, and really the whole idea there, of course, is to bring your lowest habitable area up out of harm's way. The higher you go, the better off you are, the safer you are, the less expensive that your insurance is. And that's an important concept to remember if you are in an older home, because there are some things that you can do to reduce the amount of risk by retrofitting that structure as best you can. And that's a whole nother conversation, but we can get into it in a little bit of detail this evening. Building occupancy can certainly affect premiums. Typically, a non-residential structure costs more to insure than a residential structure does. The foundation type is a very important consideration, and in the entire world, there are only 3 types of foundations: basement, slab on grade, elevated. Basement, slab on grade, elevated. What's the most likely to take on water? Basement. Least likely? Elevated. So depending upon what your foundation is, that's going to directly affect the premium that you would pay for flood insurance. Last but not least, the original date of your flood insurance policy purchase is these days very important. And the reason for that is the legislation that I'll be talking about in just a minute or two, the Bigger Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012, and I'll talk about that in a little detail, okay? Next slide, please. How can I reduce my premiums? Well, again, this is something that's really best discussed individually, hopefully with your flood insurance agent and company. I can talk to you in very general terms about some of the types of things that'll help. But again, that discussion with your current insurance agent is going to be helpful. Your agent has the ability, hopefully, to look at the overall package of insurance that you purchase and do a rate review and determine perhaps in some places where you may be able to save some money in one line of insurance so it can help pay you for a different line of insurance. And again, that's a very complex conversation that I'm very much oversimplifying here, but everybody should have their coverage situation reviewed on a pretty regular basis. And those of us in the insurance industry are probably the ones that do that least frequently of everyone else, I'm sorry to say. We've already talked about deductibles. The concept of an elevation certificate is a very important one at this point. An elevation certificate, if you're not familiar with the form, is a form that is used for a number of purposes, but it's probably most important these days for insurance rating. Because what that elevation certificate does is gives us enough information to rate a structure based on its actuarial, statistical relationship. And again, when we're talking about, as Marianne mentioned before, the concept of a base flood elevation, a base flood elevation is just another way of saying how high do we expect water to rise in a given area in a specific flooding event. And once you know what a base flood elevation is, you want to make sure, if at all possible, that your lowest floor is at or above that level. But in older structures, as you're probably already aware, lowest floors are typically below, sometimes well below the base flood elevation. And structures with their lowest floors below base flood elevation, unfortunately, are the ones that are most likely to be damaged from flooding, and therefore the ones that are more likely to cost more to insure. But the elevation certificate, long story short, and I'm going to be done in just a few minutes and I'll start answering questions. The elevation certificate gives you and us specific information that we can use so we can take the uncertainty out of insurance rating, and we can tell you very specifically what a premium is for any given structure. And while that's a very frightening situation in some respects, knowing certainly what a flood insurance premium will be is a heck of a lot better than not knowing what that flood insurance premium will be. I'm looking at the one possible means of reducing premiums by retrofitting your structure. In some cases, you may have a structure that's got a crawl space, so it's kind of an elevated building, but without flood vents around that foundation, you're not getting the advantage of the insurance rating and the elevation of that floor structure. So in some cases, you can have the foundation retrofitted with vents, and vents can be as simple as knocking a hole in the wall and putting chicken wire over it. And the whole idea of flood vents, when you boil it down, is to allow water to flow freely in and out of that area. And the reason that we want water to be able to get in and out freely is that if it builds up on one side or the other, water weighs an awful lot, there's an awful lot of hydrostatic pressure, foundation damage is very expensive to repair rather. Long story short, the question is, when is the purchase of flood insurance mandatory? When is it voluntary? It's mandatory under federal law if you have a federally backed or federally regulated loan and your property is located in a high-risk area. Some lenders will require you to buy flood insurance whether or not your property is located in a high-risk area, and that is a business practice that they have the right to impose if they choose to, and you've got two choices. Choice number one is buy it. Choice number two is go on down the road and find a different lender. There's another situation where the purchase of flood insurance is mandatory, and that is if you have been the recipient of a disaster assistance grant or loan. In those certain situations, a condition of receiving federal disaster assistance is that you promise to purchase and maintain flood insurance. Any other situation, unless I'm missing something here, you have the right to purchase or not to purchase, and that decision is yours and yours alone. Okay? All right, just a follow-up to that. The amount of insurance, when you're talking about mandatory purchase, the lender, unfortunately, can tell you how much flood insurance that you need to buy. Now, typically, the maximum amount of coverage that you would need to purchase would be about the same that you're carrying under your homeowner's policy for that same building. In some cases, you can purchase less. If you have a question about how much coverage you are being required to carry, one of the things that you may want to do is to have a conversation with your bank. Every bank has something called a compliance officer. And the compliance officer is responsible for making sure that the lender, that bank, is in compliance with federal law. And you may be able to have a conversation with the compliance officer about how much coverage you are being required to carry. It's not something that FEMA's got any ability to affect, but your lender may have the ability to change the amount of coverage that is being required for you.
I'm concerned about the variations in costs. My neighbor is paying $295 for contents and building, and the company, they now say our houses are adjoined, and they're charging me $1,400 just for building.
Okay, the question was really all about how much does it cost for one individual versus the next door neighbor of that same individual. And I'm sorry to say that I can't talk about comparisons of rates. I will tell you that what is important here is whether a policy is being rated correctly or not. And there's an awful lot of things that go into the rating of the policy. In some cases, I am sorry to say, we are not correctly rating your neighbor. But I want to take a look at your own individual rating and make sure that it is correct. That I can do, and that your insurance agent can help you with as well.
But everybody on the block is paying a different price.
And again, that's not surprising because the amount of coverage that they're buying may be different. The amount of their deductible may be different.
We've checked it.
Whatever rates are, I can only have individual conversations with folks, but what is really important is if you can't get to me, make sure that you talk to your insurance agent who is servicing that policy. Have them do a rate review, and I'll be happy to help them. All I can say at this point is, I understand your concerns. The only thing that I have to offer you this evening is information. I cannot set rates for anybody. The only thing I can do, and that I will do, is to make sure that your individual policy is being rated correctly and explain to you why it is being rated a certain way. I cannot explain to you why you may be paying more than your neighbor or your neighbor is paying less than you. I can't do that, but I can look at your own individual situation.
The other, on that
I know the people in the back could not hear me. I addressed how other people are paying different amounts all throughout this community. I know from on my block, as a committee woman, that we pay different prices on the entire block. Everybody pays a different amount for flood insurance. It took me to go through and at least 100 insurance companies, including FEMA, giving me 10 of theirs that they suggested. And not one contacted me, and I called them at least 10 times. Through all of those different insurance companies, I got a different price for every one of them. Okay? FEMA claims that it should be a certain amount. They can't charge you a different amount. Well, I'm here to tell you they do.